A lot of the work that I started right out of college was more decorative. I was really attempting to be well-versed in technique and skill to be able to accomplish more kind of conceptual ideas or more personal ideas that I kind of saw that I would mature into later on in my career. So some of the earlier work was very decorative, very technical. I was selling, there's some samples of the work here that I was doing right out of college early on. And I was selling those mostly in a department store in San Francisco called Gump's. And they were doing really well with this work, but I didn't want to expand beyond Gump's because I didn't want to get stuck to doing this type of work. Or I didn't want to rely on just doing this for a living. So I somehow just limited it to Gump's and was playing around simultaneously to other forms that I started to experiment with. So these are some of the similar pieces you see here in the window. And they're basically a technique that I developed. Some of it is combining Italian traditional techniques, but some of it is like these parts are something that it's called an incamo in an Italian style, but I actually developed a technique where you can combine multiple, as many as 20 or 30 bands of color by producing cylinders and cutting those, polishing both ends, fusing them, and then picking those back up to produce a much more kind of involved piece. So these are some platters like the ones you see here done a similar way. It's actually combining the Italian style with the style that I created, that I came up with. So I played around with this for a few years and then eventually started to play around with what was the beginning of getting into a little bit more of the sculptural work that I do now. So this was the first figurative pieces that I started to do, and I was inspired by the Homie series that you see in that they were selling in the pinball machines at supermarkets. So I did a whole series of these that also actually did really well. So I did a couple of series that were maybe 12 to 18 inches tall, depicting people that I remembered growing up with and seeing around my community. So I was kind of trying to create sculptures of people that I never see in an art form. So, just giving a representation to something that I felt was never represented in a glass form, at least. This is, once again, looking at pop culture, Mexican kind of icons, and making a sculpture, an installation out of Mexican wrestling luchadores, which is something that I feel comes from Mesoamerica as a way to, you put a mask on to change your identity. There's a transformation that happens. This is started to become, inspired by Mesoamerican sculptures and looking at that whole cultural aspect of the Mesoamerican work, and also experimenting with sculptural forms and technique. This one's called Tres Caras and is an Aztec piece. And actually we have some collectors here today that own this piece, that are good friends of mine, Ron and Pamela. So these are some of the early kind of depictions or representations of Mesoamerican sculptures that I produced in glass. And these are pretty complex pieces, they're pretty big, require definitely a team of people to manifest. It's a lot of detail. It's a whole different way of working than working with symmetrical forms. You actually have to work in a whole different way, but also using a torch. You do a lot of the detail work with a torch. These are all hand sculpted. Some of them are hollow and some of them are solid, but they're all hand sculpted. This one here is blown. So I have a couple images where it shows a little bit about the process, just to get an idea of, you have a blowpipe and you're working on this piece at the end of a pipe the whole time, just like the video. This piece is currently at Leah Skidmore Gallery at Bergamot, currently having an exhibition there of Mesoamerican work. The Mesoamerican work is something that I started early on, but I'm kind of doing other things right now. But when Leah Skidmore contacted me and said she really loved the work, and if I could make a body of work for her gallery, I was really excited because I love making them. They're just, I really put a lot into them, into the work, and I really learned a lot through making this body of work. So when she told me she was interested in doing a show with Pacific Standard Time around this work, I jumped at the opportunity, and I really we have some really beautiful installations currently there right now if you haven't seen that show. So this is part of kind of crossing into like a little bit more of the fine art realm. I did a couple of installations. The cucarachas were some of the first pieces kind of entering into that realm. And for me, they represented kind of like an irony where, you're used to cockroaches being as something grotesque, but in a glass form, there's something precious and beautiful and delicate. So, but also the idea of empowerment and just kind of pushing kind of boundaries. This piece is called Encarcelados, and is talking about the prison industrial complex, the criminalization of people of color. That's something that is a huge problem in our current system, where the U.S. is responsible for the biggest prison industrial complex by far out of anywhere in the whole world. Nobody even comes close. And a lot of the people that are imprisoned are Latinos and African Americans predominantly. So this piece is the second before you get arrested. So the minute where you have to place the hands behind your back. And it took, the glass itself, it's very ethereal and it has like a very transparent and passive quality. But the shadow in this installation was more that frustration, that angst, that anger, that is the other side of this problem. This was another piece I did that was purchased by the Oakland Museum called Charros y sus Caballos. It's also called a budget of paradoxes. But basically, I wanted to create a piece that paid homage to my ancestors and, my family, my heritage. And I come from a long lineage of charros on both sides of my parents' families. And some of the earliest memories I have of going to Mexico are seeing my uncles at a rodeo, a Mexican rodeo, and they're like both champions, both on my mom's side and my dad's side. When I was young, got to see my uncles who were champions of both their towns in these rodeo activities. And at that time, the point system of the rodeos was achieved by a paper mache flower. So the more paper mache flowers your horses had, the more points you had. So I just remember my uncle's horses being like just completely adorned with flowers. So I have this memory. So I created this piece that kind of is a little nostalgic and has to do with that first experience. This piece invited charros to come out and be part of the piece. So the piece is called Charros y sus Caballos. So I was inviting the charro community, which is a constituency that's not necessarily ever included in museums. So I thought it would be a great way to also have them be involved with the museum activities. And actually some people did come dressed as charros, including myself, obviously. This was part of an exhibition, a solo exhibition I had at in Indiana at Notre Dame University at the Snipe Museum. This was a centerpiece. She's called Once Upon a Time. The exhibition was called Torpor, and she's holding a little hummingbird. The idea of torpor was the whole premises for the exhibition, where a hummingbird, when it's in danger, it goes into hibernation as a way to survive. So if it's too cold or hasn't eaten, it will go into hibernation. It'll slow down its metabolism and heart rate, and to be able to sustain itself through the night. And then, once it's warm and safe, he comes back and is able to find food. So that was kind of what the exhibition was about, survival and being able to survive and exist harsh situations. There's an example of what something looks like at the end of a blowpipe when I'm making these giant parts. This glory hole, that's not me, that's actually one of my helpers, and he's a lot bigger than I am. So something like this is a life-size shirt. So you can imagine the size of the equipment, the pipe, and having something that's not on center, just the amount of work and technical ability that goes behind something like that is pretty extraordinary. And this piece is actually maximizing the width of one of the largest glory holes here in California. This is in Richmond, California, and he has like some of the biggest equipment. That's a gigantic glory hole. You can actually walk inside of it. He has a furnace that's 1,000 pounds. It's the size of a room. So we can make gigantic things there all day. And he's a very, very skilled, his name's Guido Gerlitz. He's a very skilled glass guy that I've been working with for years. So that shirt became this life-size sculpture, which is a Farmworker, speaking about, once again, the criminalization of people of color, criminalization of workers. As a faint United Farm Workers Union logo to talk a little bit about the whole movement and looking a little bit at the past and different movements that have led to what's happening now. But so it was really important to get a certain type of expression, certain type of posture that's kind of like almost given up or defeated in some ways, which is something that I felt very familiar with growing up in East LA and Boyle Heights. You see those faces of people that work, endless hours, and in a lot of cases they're very underappreciated and underpaid. This is a body of work that I did for MACLA, which is an organization in San Jose, and it was also part of a Glass Art Society. Was also having a conference during that time. And it has to do with the memory. It has to do a little bit about being a man and being born into a machista kind of type of community where I feel that in different layers of society, levels of society, we are taught to kind of almost be violent in a way. Like all the rituals that are like a rite of passage type of rituals are kind of violent. So I was about 14 years old when I went hunting with some family members, and I was taught how to shoot a gun, and we went hunting for deer, and it felt like a rite of passage, but it also felt like a very violent rite of passage. And I actually was at a point where I was about to shoot a deer, and I couldn't do it because I just felt like I don't need to do this. Why? It seemed so alien to me. But also the memory of seeing trophy heads mounted on my uncle's house were something that was very alien to me as well. I just couldn't understand why somebody would put an animal head on a wall. It just seemed like I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying that it was an experience that I felt as a young Latino male, and it's something that I feel that is something that has happened for many hundreds of years in different communities and different cultures for different reasons. So I have kind of like maybe a Western, more trophy type style, but then there's also kind of like an indigenous, more native maybe approach to paying homage to an animal and paying tribute to something that it's gonna be food to you. Also, in Native cultures, there are those types of rite of passage rituals. These are some of the current Mesoamerican sculptures that are being exhibited at Leah Skidmore Contemporary Gallery. And so this is a 4-foot by 4-foot sculpture. And I believe scholars call it the offering, but it was found in a ceremonial center, which is one of the first ceremonial centers of Mesoamerica, in what is now Tabasco. But the ceremonial center is called La Venta. And some of the colossal heads were found there. And this piece was found buried about 8 feet underground in this fashion. So I tried to replicate the work in glass to simulate jade and some of the natural materials that they were using at that time. And once again, glass has the fragility. It's almost like talking about the fragility of culture. As a Latino who grew up in Boyle Heights, I always feel like, I consider myself Mexican American, Latino, and Chicano. I consider myself a glass artist. I consider myself a sculptor. There's a lot of things. I always kind of felt like I was between two worlds. The Mexican world of my parents and where they came from, and then the world here in the U.S. And it always seemed like a fragile kind of juggling to me. So glass became something that was something very natural as a way to express myself. So these are also sculptures. These are the current Mesoamerican work. This piece is about that big, and it's representing the Chipicuero culture, Western Mexico. This is the Nayarit sculptures. So, in creating this work, you learn a lot about yourself and who you are. Or in my case, I learned a lot about, just different things, different symbolisms, the different icons, the different rituals, and the different approaches to art making. The Nayarit people were one of the first to make hollow figures in clay in this continent. So it's kind of the exhibition is called Contemporary Relics, a tribute to the makers, and it's paying homage to the first sculptors and artisans of the continent, really, and looking at their techniques and their, in a different, obviously I'm making them in glass, but I'm learning a lot about the culture and what these pieces represented. This piece was actually featured on the cover of American Craft magazine, which had a feature story. So these are from the Olmec culture. This is an installation of ídolos. Once again, looking at the different cultures, the different time periods, starting from pre-classic, Olmec to the late classic period. And I was looking a lot at, I was really drawn to the figure first. I was finding images and looking at the different figures and being inspired by the actual form and then producing those pieces. But I realized that a lot of these were from the same culture. They came from the Chipicuero culture at different time periods. So I found myself drawn to this specific culture, the Chipicuero culture, and these little ones too that are painted and very intricate, just like the big Chipicuero mask.
What is the scale of each one?
These are anywhere from 4 inches to about 6 inches. So they're fairly small pieces, and I think I have another slide that shows how they're mounted. I had to literally hand create a bracket that was individual for each piece. So they're very involved, they're very detailed. You're really looking at the different, starting like from the Olmec to, these are both Chipicuero. And they started with short arms, big heads, almond eyes, and then they became more refined, and then the painting, the surface decoration became much more intricate. So just these forms are amazing. I mean, just the form itself has a language that you see in modern times. In making a lot of these, it almost reminds you of different things you've seen growing up. So a lot of these were reminiscent to me of just a lot of the things that you see nowadays were influenced by these cultures in so many different ways that we can't even begin to imagine. Now we go into the show currently here at Crafting America Center. So this is a kind of close to a life-size piñata. It's a glass piñata. A lot of these parts are glass elements. And a paper mache, something that kind of comes back in some of the work I do. So it's kind of combining something precious and delicate like the glass, and then with something that's more accessible and maybe not as expensive or precious. Here's a little bit of the process again. We have the blowpipe. We have a whole team. There's probably about 2 more guys here that you can't see. But usually when I'm making these big sculptures, I use a team of about 6 to 8 people. And this was the figure that's going to be holding a stick that's going to be the centerpiece next door that represents the boy hitting the piñata. And once you put the whole piece together, I was trying to align the hands in the proper place for him to hold the stick. So I had an actual stick that I was kind of sliding in and out to get that to align correctly. And that's the last thing you want to do at the very end. So it was kind of nerve-wracking, but it worked out. And like I said, there's a great team at Corning. Very fortunate to be able to work there with this amazing team and amazing facilities. So here's a figure with the stick. And then here are some of the other pieces that are next door. There's a little boy. He has a blindfold on, kind of alluding to the Pinata celebration ritual. He's kind of holding his hand out. I actually don't have the sister here, but she's next door. You can see her. She's actually looking for his hand, turning back. So there's kind of an interaction going on there. And then this is the piece you see out the window, little girl covering her face. I thought it was very important to hide their faces because these are representing immigrant children or refugee children, and in many cases we don't know who they are. We don't know their stories. We don't know their faces. They're almost invisible to us, but they exist, and they're in detention centers, or some of them made it, to this country, but we still don't know their story. So part of this exhibition was a really important element of this exhibition was to have their stories be part of it. If not, that's in this instance, I think it's one of the most important elements of this installation is the stories, the handwritten firsthand accounts of actual children who went through the process of migration to come here. They were brave enough to share their stories with us. So if you go next door, you can read the firsthand accounts of a lot of these children. There's about, I think, over 100 handwritten letters, and we just had another group of a class come in yesterday who are also going to share their stories. A lot of them, it was very touching to hear that most of the kids that were here yesterday from Van Nuys, most of them were migrants that came here unaccompanied, and a lot of them went through a detention process to be able to come to be part of living here. So, part of when you're talking about really heavy things, I try to soften them by giving elements of something that's more playful. So the Pinata celebration is trying to lure the viewer to kind of investigate a little bit more of what's happening here. So it's a little playful, but then you see the serious aspects to it. So the fence and the blindfolds, which can represent uncertainty, the broken glass, which can mean the dangers, obviously, that these kids kind of have to overcome. So here's a kind of interaction, which is a really, really difficult thing to imagine when you're making the pieces, because to have things align somewhat in the fashion that you want is, when you're working so just kind of kind of spontaneous, it's a very difficult thing to try to make work accurately. So she's wearing huaraches, and here are some of the letters. So we just kind of tacked them on the wall. Some of them are very touching. They're from all parts of the world. They're not just Mexico or Central America. They're from Thailand, from Switzerland, from Senegal, just different parts of the world, India, and then that's it. Thank you.